Welcome everyone. This is going to be a presentation on open source and mostly about the business models around open source. But let me start with just giving a brief presentation of myself. I studied in Lund Institute of Technology, worked mostly within telecom and mobile software engineering. I joined Sony Ericsson at 2004, and that became later Sony Mobile. And I left the spring of 2019. In 2009, I became the head of open source with assignment to company-wide pave the way for and to lead open source in Sony Mobile. I've been engaged in research projects. One was the European Union research project Scalare in 2013 to 16. And that in turn led to I wrote the book, Principles for Industrial Open Source, which is a description of open source governance programs for industrials. I have in addition co-authored a handful of academic papers on open source governance, and I'm a frequent speaker on this topic. For now, in Debricht, which is specialized in open source software vulnerabilities. But let's go on to the business. I'm going to tell you about the story of Sony Mobile and how we had a journey of open source, because that became the foundation for the speak further on. So the background is in 2008, we actually had 4 mobile operating systems. All of them were commercial or proprietary operating systems. Our own developed operating system, OSA. And then in addition, for some smartphones in Symbian UIQ. And also for the entry level, we have for the basic models, we had an entry mobile operating system. And then for the more advanced phones, we had Microsoft Windows phones. At that time, I was a software strategist at Sony Ericsson, and we were seeing the clear signs that open source was entering the scene, predominantly with Linux. So I wrote in 2008 a strategy, and I said that within a couple of years, we will see that open source will starting to make a dent into the mobile operating system market. And so it did really. Just 14 months after my strategy papers, then we actually closed down our own proprietary mobile operating system. And we started to work with Android. So open source was formally adopted by 2009. In 2010, we had closed down everything that it was not open source based. And in fact, we abandoned Symbian, who became open source in 2011. So for 2011 and on, we were working only with an Android mobile operating system, which is entirely open source based. So it went very quickly, just 3 years from working fully proprietary to fully open source based. What is also in this story is that what happened when Google introduced Android is that they completely destroyed the commercial or mobile operating system market. And in fact, in 2017, the death of the last commercial operating system occurred when Microsoft Windows phones gave up. So this fast transition from proprietary to open source, and I get the assignment to lead this transition for the company, led me to starting to think a lot about what is open source and what is the implications of open source. And the first thing I came to understand is that open source is not only, as is initially perceived, just something about code and licenses. That is just a concern for the software developers and maybe a little bit for the legal department. But it's actually more than that. It's also a development model and a culture. that makes dents into the company's ways of doing development, and you have to start to rethink the ways you're working. But in addition to that, open source is also a market disruptor and a business builder. So open source is all these things together, and they will affect your business models. Above all, you have to get an answer how to get paid when the software is free. I developed an open source maturity model on which steps we needed to take in order to get more mature, that is, having higher capabilities and competences in handling open source. And the first initial steps from incidental and to repetitive use was very much engineering driven. So we started to learn how to do all the processes necessary to handling open source, such as intake, compliance, contributions, and distribution of open source. But soon enough, when you're starting to enter in the more high levels, you're starting to have to take business considerations as well. Then you're starting to think about creating your own communities and attracting partners to work together and building software together with others. And it could go all the way up to the highest level when you have such a competence in introducing open source in the marketplace, you actually disrupt the marketplace. And the point here is that exactly that what Google did with Android. Just to give you a picture of how big open source is today. This is the latest GitHub figures I have collected. They're from by the end of last year. Today we are counting about 56 million software developers that are engaged in open source. That is, the 56 million accounts are existing in GitHub. And GitHub is not the only place you can find open source. There are others as well, like GitLab and other sources as well. But GitHub alone has 56 million open source developers. The amount of repositories or projects, if you want to put it in this way, is more than 128 million. And it's accounted for that you have at least 41 billion lines of code in GitHub. Every day, 1,100 projects are started. Every day, more than 10,000 revisions are made into the projects. So today, without question, open source is gigantic. Today, I'm going to focus more about the fundamental business models that comes with open source. This is maybe not so familiar for most of you, but I'm going to show that it's not that strange really, and it's well working already in the industry. But let me walk you through all these three. So the first one, I call it the indirect business model. And this is really traditional, is that when you're taking revenue, you collect it for both the hardware and the software. So you're taking actually a premium on the hardware offering for paying for the software. The second one is called the extended business model. When you can't get paid for the software itself because it's open source licensed, you're collecting revenue from something that is related to the core offering, like services or add-ons, service tools or other add-ons. And the third business model, and that is a little bit more exclusive, is called the asymmetric business model. When you collect on revenue that is seemingly unrelated from the core offering, and this is paid by data or ads or something that is not really directly connected to the software offering. So looking a little bit more in detail, the indirect business model, this is actually what we had in Sony Mobile. So we develop the hardware device, and that we added on Android. Android itself was open source, but selling the device, which is a combination of hardware and software, you can get paid for the system, so to speak, and you take a premium on the hardware for paying for the software. In addition, you may add services, which you can get revenue from. A note here when talking about how much of the software were we actually developing and get paid through the hardware premium. Well, if we look into the experiences from Sony Xperia mobile handsets, roughly 87% of the code was unmodified Android open source code. And roughly 8% of the code was by us modified Android open source code. So it's only about 5% of the total code of an Xperia handset that was own and proprietarily developed software. So for those 5%, we get a quite good hefty premium. Continue now with the extended business model. And this is nothing very strange. This is actually getting paid for additional services, such as development or for maintenance and support, or for tools, or for other software that is necessary for the environment. But the core offering of software is open source and free of charge. This is starting to be very popular, I would say, and very big in business. And the prime example of this is the company Red Hat that was acquired by 2019 by IBM for $34 billion US. So today, this is what I would say is the really successful business model, providing open source and then getting revenue for everything that's running these open source. The third one is a little bit exclusive one, and this is the business model that Google is using. So Google is providing with Android that is open source, but in addition, they're providing services such as the Google mobile services, Google Maps, Google Play, and so on. And they're providing this for free to the users. And the reason is because they're collecting a lot of data. That data is fed onto other Google services that they're getting revenue, such as the Google Ad and search business. So the idea here is that you're providing both the software and the services for free, and forces that the revenue and profit goes to the services that you need to have. Google is using this model as well into, for instance, Kubernetes. Kubernetes was developed by Google in 2017 and released as open source. And then Google actually released it to a foundation and made it available, totally available and controlled by all the members in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And the reason is because Google makes quite a lot of revenue by having Kubernetes driving in their data centers. One of the aims, if you're creating an extended or an asymmetric business model, is to create an open source ecosystem. In the center, you have an open source platform, and often you have what is called an open core licensing model. That means that the framework, the platform, is available as open source, and everyone can get engaged in the development of this platform. But our platform also provides a platform for additional services. These services could be open source themselves, or it could be commercial services provided by some other actors. That in turn creates the foundation for having a marketplace. There is also a place where you can provide with tools, free or commercially available, and for professional services surrounding this open source platform. That is in sense what is happening with the Google Android. Android has an open source ecosystem around it, and there's a lot of actors involved, but it's all controlled by Google. That enables Google also to provide for schemes like revenue sharing. So actually, Mobile get paid for one of the revenues that Google had with the ad and search business. And that makes the whole ecosystem to really benefit and grow the whole market. But I do expect to findings going to happen with open source and open source based business in IoT is that you will see a mixture of these free open source based business models. In the lower layers, there will be the indirect business model when you are selling devices, which includes both hardware and software, and you can take a premium on the hardware to pay, so to speak, for the free software. In the middle tier and the middle layers, you will probably expect to see quite a lot of the so-called extended business model. The software will be free, open source based and open source licensed, but it will be provided with additional services and tools for developing the mid-tier layers. And then on the top, on the levels 6 and 7, you will find possibly strikes of asymmetric business models, enabling an ecosystem, enabling revenue sharing, and a good drive for the whole business area. What I'm foreseeing that is open source is going to continue even further. It's going to go a drive towards more of an integration work, not in-house development. The engineers of future will mix freely between in-house developed code, open source code, and third-party code to bring the new solutions. And you can compare what happened with the Sony mobile experience of mobile devices that in the end it was just about 5% of our own code that was in part of the devices. So the bulk of software will be commoditized by open source communities. But this also drives quite largely productivity gains. So as presented, open source itself is not really a business model by itself, but it will definitely affect your businesses and business models. And you have to take account what open source will make with them. And that was the conclusion of my speak. Thank you very much.